What's up everyone, Nate Vincent here with SPA, and we're going to be changing the front brakes on a 2018 Volvo XC90. So the car we're going to be changing the front brakes on today is a 2018 Volvo XC90 T5 Momentum. Now the same process is going to apply to a 2016 to 2023 or current model generation XC90. Now remember though, there's two different brake packages that are found on this car. Make sure you click the tech tip in the description below to identify what brakes your car needs. Now, before we get started, let's go over the tools that we need to get this job done. All right, in order to do this job, you're going to need a number of tools. You're going to need something to compress the caliper. Right here we have a CTA caliper compressor. If you don't have this, you can use some channel locks or vice grips. You're going to need a couple torque wrenches, a couple ratchets. You're also going to want a little 90-degree pick. You're also going to need an 18mm socket, something to hang the caliper from, a little wire brush to clean up some of the brake parts. And as far as the small tools, you're going to need a T30 to remove the brake rotor, 19mm wheel socket. You're going to need an 11mm to remove the caliper from the caliper bracket. Now 11mm is a little bit random, so if you don't have an 11mm, you may want to look for a 7/16 American socket, very nearly identical to the same size. Now you have an 18mm socket. You want to make sure before you start the job that you have your wheel lock tool. This is critical. A lot of these cars have wheel locks on them. You will not be able to get the wheels off unless you have that tool. You will also need a 7mm socket to be able to get the brake line off of the suspension upright. Now for chemicals, you're going to want some blue medium strength Loctite. You're going to want some Permatex or some other sort of anti-seize. Sure, you're going to want some Lick-O-Moly ceramic paste. This is really critical to make sure you lubricate the brakes and that once you're done with the job, the brakes don't start squealing. So now that we know what we're going to need, let's hop in and let's get this job done. All right, so the first thing we're going to show you here is just in case you're doing this job driveway style and don't have access to this wonderful lift that we have, where are you going to lift the car up from with your pump jack? Now, right here is an ideal location right on the right front corner or left front corner to put the jack, lift the car up, and then you have access to this panel right here to place a jack stand to make sure the car does not come down. We always recommend anytime you're lifting a car with a hydraulic jack that you have a mechanical jack stand to support the car's weight just in case. So the first step is we're going to get the wheel off. Number one step there is to get these little plastic caps off. A nice little 90-degree pick works really well for that. Make sure you don't scratch the wheels. They are pretty sensitive to being scratched. So the next step is we're going to use our 19mm impact. We're going to buzz the lugs off the wheels. If you don't have an impact wrench, you can use a long breaker bar. And before we get that going, we're going to start on the lock. The lock looks something like this and is also found in your toolkit in the back of the car. So if you guys have the factory lock on them, make sure you identify that you have this before you start the job, or else you're going to realize really quickly that you're at a dead end. All right, so the first step, once we have the wheel off, is we're going to get this anti-rattle clip out. Easiest way to do it is actually just to compress this in with your fingers, just like that. And then you can use that pick that you use to get the wheel nuts off, to kind of pop it out a little bit. So now I'm going to spin this around, make it a little easier to see what's going on behind here. All right, so the next step is we're going to pop these little plastic plugs off the back. That's going to gain access to the pins that hold the caliper. So the next step is we're going to remove the pins that hold the caliper to the carrier. Now this is an 11mm socket in here. 11mm is a pretty oddball size, so if you don't have an 11mm, you can try a 7/16 American. That's a pretty close match. It's a little bit more snug, so be very careful to not get it too far in there and too stuck. But we understand that 11mm is not a common size Allen bolt, so be prepared if you're doing this job. So now that we have the pins out, before we go and wrestle this caliper off the carrier, we want to undo the 7mm nut right here holding the brake line on. That's going to give us a lot more mobility with this caliper, and we also want to make sure we have zip ties or hooks, something to basically hold this caliper up and out of the way so we're not putting the weight of the caliper on the sensitive brake line right here. Make sure that's good and free. Now grabbing my hook, we're going to wrestle this caliper off. Give it a little bit of wiggle. Next step is we're going to loosen up the 18mm caliper carrier bolts. So there's two bolts, one here, and they hold this caliper carrier on too. the suspension upright, that's going to allow us to remove the brake rotor. Now before I fully loosen these up and take these out, I'm going to come back around the front here and we're going to loosen up the rotor carrier bolt right here. The reason why I'm leaving this caliper carrier on, even if it's just loose for now, is just in case this doesn't want to come free. It allows me to put a screwdriver in here and stop the rotor from rotating up against this caliper carrier. All right, so now using a T30 bit, we're going to loosen up this set screw right here. Like I said, you see how the rotor is rotating? That's why we left this caliper carrier on. I can simply take a screwdriver, place it in here, and it will stop against the caliper carrier. Allow me to loosen that up, just like that. Take this all the way out. And now we're going to finish up taking out these 18mm caliper carrier bolts. All right, so next thing we're going to do is use a dead blow, and we're going to release this rotor from the hub. So now is a good time, while we have the rotor off, to clean up this area. You can see that there's some scaling and debris from that rusty old rotor on here. We're going to clean this all up. We're going to add a little bit of anti-seize to this hub here to make sure the new rotor doesn't seize onto that, and then we're going to install the new rotor. All right, so I'm just cleaning up the face of this hub right here and the snout right here. We're going to put a little bit of anti-seize. Don't put too much on there because we don't want to not allow the rotor to sit onto the hub straight, but we certainly want to make our next brake job just as easy as the first. So just painting a little bit on here all the way around. The two spots you really want to make sure you get are this outer ring right here and this inner ring right here. This is actually recessed where the lugs sit, so you don't really have to worry about it because it will never make contact with the rotor itself. That looks good. Now we're going to take our fresh Zimmerman rotor. We're going to make sure we line up our pin hole right here, and then we're just going to place this on the hub. Now we're going to reinstall our set screw. We're going to make sure we put a little anti-seize on this too. If any of you've done brake jobs on older cars, you can know that this could be quite a pain to get loose once it gets rusted in there. All right, torque this down. This is 5 Newton meters. So we're just going to give it a little bit of a flick of our wrist, making sure that the rotor is flat against the hub. Now as we prepare to put the caliper bracket on, we want to make sure we clean the threads and the mounting surfaces so we get a really solid mating surface up against the hub. And we also want to make sure that the threads are ready to accept some Loctite. We're going to want to use some blue medium strength Loctite on this. Just using a wire brush here, I'm cleaning up the mating surfaces so there's nothing that's going to offset the alignment of the caliper. And then moving over to the caliper bracket itself, we're going to pull the bolts out. We're going to clean up this mating surface as well. You can see all that Loctite on there. We're going to try to clean that up as much as possible. And then we're also going to clean up the threads on these bolts. As you can see, the residue of Loctite, we're going to get all that off, and then we're going to apply some new blue Loctite. All right, so using the blue Loctite, I'm going to put just a teeny bit of Loctite on these threads, prep these bolts to go back in, just like that. Now we're going to grab the 18mm wrench. We're going to snug these guys down. Last but not least, we're going to now torque the two 18mm bolts to 200 Newton meters. So here we are, we have the caliper right here. Now it's time to prep the caliper to install it to the caliper bracket. First thing we're going to do is we're going to pop these old pads out, and then we're going to push the piston back in to kind of reset everything. Easy way to pop the pads out is kind of just push them. They are adhesive to the caliper itself, so it may take a little bit of force or a little bit of a screwdriver to pry it. As you can see, all that adhesive there separating. Now the opposite side is held in with a spring clip, so we're going to just pop this out. You can see the spring clip that lives inside the piston of the brake caliper. So now we're going to recess this piston back in. Same sort of thing as the caliper bracket. We're just going to want to clean up any of the rubbing surfaces any of the places that are actually holding weight or holding the pad in place. So just kind of clean this up a little bit. We're going to use a CTA Tools caliper bracket or caliper spreader. If you don't have this, vice grips work, channel locks work pretty well. So there's a multitude of ways that you can do this. So now that we have the caliper all cleaned up, next thing we're going to do is install the pads. Now this is a little different than typical because we have an adhesive backer on this outside pad right here. So we're going to pull this adhesive strip off, and it's sort of a gummy adhesive backer, and that's going to paste the pad right to the side of the caliper. It's also going to keep the pad from vibrating, and those little pad vibrations is actually what makes your brakes squeal. So it's really important to do this well. We're going to line this up. You can see right here. So we're lined up with both our side tabs, and then we're going to slide this out to the outside, just like making sure we're really locked in there. Now on the inside, it's more traditional with the spring clip. We're going to put a little bit of grease. Actually, make sure our boot is folded down correctly. We're going to put a little bit of grease on here, and we're going to install it. All right, so now that we have the caliper loaded, we're going to basically turn this whole assembly around, and we're going to slide it right on the bracket. What I like to do is right before I get to slide it on the bracket, you can see I greased up the front of this pad. I'm going to grease up the front of this pad as well, and also the two rails in which the pads slide. That's just going to stop any extra vibrations from basically transmitting through this, which is in turn going to turn into brake squeal. So if you want good quiet brakes, this is the time to really spend the extra time and do the extra effort to make sure they don't squeal. All right, so now we're going to actually install the brake caliper to the carrier. I'm going to undo this clip here. I'm going to remove this hook that we've been using to hold it in place. Now we're just going to spin this around and just carefully slide it on the rotor and into its mounting location. Just like that. Now we're going to grab our two caliper pins right here. We're going to put a little bit of grease around the bottom collar, and then we're going to slide them right in these grommets and screw them into the caliper carrier. Now it's time to tighten down the bolts that hold the caliper to the caliper carrier. These are going to be tightened down to 57 Newton meters. All right, so now don't forget to tighten down the brake line bracket that holds the brake line. And remember, this little pin right here goes into the suspension upright, just like that. And then we have a 7mm head bolt that's going to hold this all together. So the last thing here we're going to do is put the dust covers back over the grommets. So dust cover on the top, dust cover on the bottom. Now we are ready to turn this thing around and put the anti-rattle clip on the front side. So the last job here before we put the wheel on is to put the anti-rattle clip on. What we're going to do is we're going to pop it on one side and grab the edge right here, and then we're going to straighten it out and get it to slide in the other side. It's a little bit of finagling, you can see here. And then we just got to get this edge around. Hold on. So now we're going to stretch this part around and get this on the front of the caliper. And then arguably the most satisfying part of this project. Now it's time to bolt the wheel back on. Make sure we're lined up. So at this point, we're done with the job. We're going to lower the car down on the ground so we have some friction on the bottom of the tire. We're going to torque the wheels down to 80 foot-pounds, and then we're going to be ready for a test drive. All right, and that concludes this brake DIY on this Volvo. The left side will be exactly the same as the right side. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below. If you like this video, give us a thumbs up. If you want to see more content like this, please subscribe to our channel. We'll catch you on the next one.